Thank you for joining us this evening. I am Jennifer Dye, a librarian at Detroit Public Library. The library has had a strong program with the League of Women Voters Detroit for over a year now. We present on issues of concern to Michigan voters and other voters about 10 months of the year. You were brought into this program muted. Please put any questions into the chat. Ruth Coolwine will capture these questions and ask them at the end of the presentation. We might be able to allow people to unmute at the end to ask questions directly if time allows. This presentation will be recorded and will be made available on DPL's and the Detroit League's websites. Rhonda Craig, president of the League of Women Voters Detroit, will speak briefly about the League and the Detroit group.
Hello all, it's so good that you came to this event. This is an excellent program hosted by the Detroit League of Women Voters and the Detroit Public Library. And it's so you can know something about what's going on in your community and address any issues that you see that should come up that we might be interested in working with. The Detroit League of Voters is a nonprofit, nonpartisan political organization with national, state, and local components. For over a century, it's been over 100 years, the League of Women Voters has worked to empower voters by informing citizens about their local candidates, public policy, and advocacy programs. We encourage informed and active participation in government. The League does not endorse candidates or political parties. Our goal is to have elected officials represent our entire community and not just a few people. We work to ensure each and every vote is counted and that the voting systems are fair, free, and accessible to all. We invite everybody to join us to make democracy work in our communities. The League of Women Voters of Detroit is open to new members who share our ideals. The League registers new voters. We educate voters on upcoming elections, and we advocate for voters' rights. We work to engage the areas of Detroit, Hamtramck, and Highland Park. We want to bring decision-making and issues to the forefront of our citizens. Membership is open to everyone. We seek diversity, equity, and inclusion in all our endeavors. So join us. You can find us at lwvdetroit.org or on Facebook, because you can be a force for change for the community, for yourself, and our country. And I have to give you our motto: democracy is not a spectator sport. Thank you. Jennifer, up to you. Jennifer, you're muted.
Thank you. Yes, I'm sure there's a sign for that. I was taking care of a bit of housekeeping. Dessa had gotten disconnected. So we are talking today about the issues faced by those with disabilities in voting, which are considerations that are not often thought of when people are talking about limitations to voting. Our presenters tonight will be, sorry, pulling up my correct. Oh, I need to put on the live transcription. Would one of my co-hosts do so? Pardon this digression. We have three panelists tonight: Dessa, Cosma, Tameka, Spruce, and Cathy McAdam. Dessa Cosma is the founding director of Detroit Disability Power, which organizes disabled people and allies around issues like accessible, affordable housing, access to health care, transit, and education, and voting rights. Dessa has spent the last 20 years organizing for reproductive, economic, racial, and disability justice, and holds a master's degree in social justice. Tameka Spruce has a strong passion for disability advocacy and media. It started at 21 years old as Ms. Wheelchair Michigan 2006. Tameka has been advocating for over 15 years for access to affordable and accessible housing, fighting against voting oppression towards people with disabilities, racial and gender injustices, and health equity. Cathy McAdam has 20 years experience in rehabilitative medicine as a master's level medical social worker at the Rehabilitation Institute of Michigan. She worked part-time with Michigan Disability Rights Coalition, the MDRC, leading assistive technology, AT, projects to improve access to assistive technology devices and services. She is now retired and serves as the president of a local Lions Club working on a district-wide AT recycling project. She is also an active member of the League of Women Voters and contributes to several chapters. Sean Lamar is our ASL interpreter this evening. And I am now going to highlight the speakers and then begin asking the questions. And I apologize for this delay. I'm not seeing Tameka. To begin with, I'm going to try to find Tameka again, but Dessa, this is Jennifer Dye, and I would like to start with the first question. Why is access important?
Sure, thank you so much. And I see Tameka, so she is definitely in the house.
Right.
I'm not sure what the hiccup is, but I don't think you can turn her mute off either.
I will see what I can do.
Okay, thank you. So I'm really glad to be here. I appreciate the opportunity. And as was said, my name is Dessa. I think access is important for all sorts of reasons. But in the context of this conversation, when I think about the whole point of democracy, in my mind, the whole point of democracy is that it actually works for everyone. The whole point of democracy is that the people are making decisions about our collective existence. And yes, our system is flawed. Our democratic systems systemically exclude certain people, certain groups of people, and that's what we're all here working on fighting against. But ultimately, I do have a lot of faith in the idea of democracy. And the idea of democracy is that we get to weigh in and we get to have a say, and that for that to truly be functional, everyone has to have the equal opportunity to do so. So that's the baseline of why access is important to me in this context. I think additionally, disabled people, disabled voters specifically, have valuable insights and contributions to add to this experiment of democracy that we're all a part of. And it's that value add that is one more reason that it's really important that disabled folks are able to easily, conveniently, accessibly turn out to vote. And we want to invest in our communities. You know, disabled people want to be part of making our communities better. Being able to participate in decision-making is a key piece of being able to be truly bought into and invested in our communities. Because when we aren't really able to equitably show up and have a say in how decisions are made, I think the results of that is, you know, kind of an opting out, doing something else with one's time, and maybe not focused on the collective beautiful thing that is deciding together who to elect and what to support. So that's a kind of a baseline for me.
Thank you, Dessa. Tameka, would you like to address the question?
Yes. So access is, important to, voting and people with disabilities. I think that's definitely explained a lot of, the same reasons. I would say that as well. But then also, I think of, why access is important because this is our way of, you know, sharing our voice, participating in, democracy, who's going to represent us. Also, it gives us an opportunity, for, representation, getting people in office who, going to represent, our needs and our interests as people with disabilities. And also, I see, as far as with access and standing on the shoulders, of our, and or particularly my, ancestors, who have died, during the civil rights movement, and everything like that, what they had to endure. My Shiro, Fannie Lou Hamer, who put herself out there and wasn't afraid to, to raise, her voice and participate, running for office and things like that. So, so when I think of access, I think of, sharing your voice and putting people into office who are supposedly supposed to work for you.
Thank you, Tameka. Cathy, do you have
Yeah.
to say about why access is important?
Yes, and I'm going to give a little bit of an individual spin. As a blind person, access is important to me to be able to vote independently, to be able to verify my vote, and to not depend on somebody filling out an absentee ballot. And I know that absentee ballots are very useful and important for many people, but in my case, access to the polls with some electronic devices was key. And I'll talk more about that. But so that's the individual spin for all the other reasons that both ladies also talked about.
Thank you, Cathy. Dessa, can you talk more about the problems you have encountered with access?
Sure. Yeah, I actually have two stories that I wanted to share with you all this evening. Both are my personal experiences. So I'm a wheelchair user. I'm also a little person, so I'm about 3.5 feet tall. So my access needs are primarily around the built environment and what kind of buildings I can or cannot get into, what kind of things I can or cannot reach. And back in 2016, a very important election, I went to vote at a polling location that was new to me. I got in the building in my wheelchair just fine, rolled up to the table, signed in just fine, got my ballot, was ready to go. I turned around and there was nowhere in the precinct where I could actually reach to vote. All of the polling stations were standing height. So it was above my head. And being an activist and being a self-advocate, I turned around to the poll workers and I said, "Oh, excuse me, where can I vote?" These are all standing height. And the poll worker was very sweet, but had a very inappropriate response, which was, "Here, baby, you can vote right here." And she just moved the papers away from the table directly next to her. So I would be voting at the table where all the people were walking through, where all the poll workers were sitting doing paperwork. And I thought, this isn't right. I'm entitled to a private voting experience. And I'm absolutely proud of who I voted for in that election, but it's not really anybody else's business who it is. And so what that told me in that moment was, oh, wow, they didn't plan for somebody like me to show up. They didn't even have me in mind when they set up this room and adjusted these polling stations. And so that night, I actually think Tameka and Cathy were on the phone call that I had later that night. But I was on the call with some disability activists and I told them what happened. And universally, every single person on that call, it was about a dozen people, had their own story of having a challenge voting because the polling station wasn't accessible. And I thought, well, damn, if every one of us is having a problem and every one of us has a different disability, this is kind of serious. And that's, for me, was a real wake up call. Another really quick story, fast forward to the 2020 election, also highly important election. I went in to vote at a different polling location because I had moved. And I decided that I wanted to use the accessible voting machine, which anyone is entitled to use. You don't have to prove disability. And so I got there and nobody knew how to use the machine. And that was really disheartening. And I don't want to overly, I'm not really putting shade on poll workers here, because I think the system by which a lot of poll workers learn what they need to do that day is just too overwhelming to also remember how to use this somewhat complex machine. But the result of not having anyone there who knew how to use the machine could have very well resulted in disabled people not being able to vote that day. And that's very serious. And so I was there there was not a ton of questions on the ballot. I was there for almost an hour while they tried to figure out how to use the machine. And then when it printed out my ballot, they had to make several phone calls to the clerk's office. Like, it was a whole thing. A lot of people would have just left, but I had a little bit of time and I definitely had the desire to stay. And when it finally worked and they printed out my ballot, you all may know, if you're poll workers, the paper size is different that comes out of these accessible voting machines. And so the tabulator wouldn't accept my ballot because it thought it wasn't real. And so then I actually ended up having to leave with my ballot sitting on top of a machine, not actually having been calculated. And that made me very uncomfortable because it was really important to me that my vote counted. And so that's just a risk that no one should have to take. Nobody should go in to vote, be eligible to vote, actually vote, and then not be sure if it was counted, because they use the accessible voting machine that's required by law to be in that polling location. So we've got some room for training improvements and general kind of disability consciousness improvements.
Thank you, Dessa. This is Jennifer again, and I want to say that we have found out what the problem was with chat. And if you could not reach chat before, you should be able to now. Ruth will be collecting the questions and we'll ask at the end. Tameka, could you share a story about problems you've encountered with access?
Yes, so I would say it's similar to Dessa in the sense of when I was trying to use the voting machine. You know, it wasn't working. They didn't know what to do. They had to, the poll workers had to call people, you know, in the clerk's office. So it seemed like, you know, when there was a voting machine, you know what to do. So I didn't have to wait. And so, and I had to go. So what I did was, I do use a wheelchair, but I have the use of my hands. So I just went ahead and voted manually, you know, like others, and just put it how they had like a desk available where I could sit and just fill it out. So that's what I chose to do. I'm trying to remember if it was a privacy shield. It wasn't like desk where they said, you know, just move over papers. It was a desk that was standing off to, you know, the side for people in wheelchairs or seating can use. So that's what I decided to do. But I'm thinking for those who you may not have the ability, you know, of their hands and things that, you know, they would have had to sit there for long periods of time. And then other times when I had voted, there was no voting machines at all. So yeah, it's a major issue that I've seen across the board in my experience in voting, but then also in my advocacy efforts for other people with disabilities. The voting machine is one of the top issues.
Thank you, Tameka. Cathy?
Yes, I was starting with voting accessibility in around 2002 when we were just testing the machines to see how they would work when they were just being introduced, and maybe a little later than that. And I was on a commission for disability concerns at that time. And the stories just were all over the place as far as access to poll sites for wheelchair users. Many times they could get in the building, and sometimes there were temporary ramps that weren't so great. But then there wasn't always parking access. And over the years, I've continued to hear these stories from people on a regular basis. For myself, one of the things that happened, I think it was in 2018, I had been using the voting machine with many of the same stories that you've just heard. But we've gotten pretty good at it. My precinct knew me. They knew the voting machine pretty well. And they got used to the fact that I was coming. Well, in 2018, they changed the software on the machine, and we couldn't get it started because it wasn't starting up the same way. There was a different button that had to be activated. And when we finally did get it going, the synthesized speech that was being used for me to hear was quite different and not nearly as understandable. And at first I thought it was me. You know, you always do that, I think, in many cases. You start thinking, well, is it them? Is it me? What did I do wrong? And then I read an article in the newspaper by an activist who was blind in Michigan who had exactly the same experience. And so what happened is they updated it thinking they were keeping up to date and doing a good job, but there was just enough change without testing it with people who might have been able to tell them what was going on. So it's an ongoing process, that's for sure.
Sounds like it needs more testing when they make an upgrade.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Cathy. Correct document. Cathy, I'll ask you to go next. What is the impact of access problems at the polls?
Well, I think if people are disenfranchised because they can't vote because of some of the situations we've described, and many people don't have the time to stay around and wait for the city clerk or somebody to come in to fix a problem. That's probably the biggest possibility, is being disenfranchised on the only day that you have available to vote. And I think it can be just very awkward. There's times I hadn't been able to use the machine and I have to stand in a voting booth with people of the different parties on either side of me. I mean, you're squished into this tiny spot and your private vote isn't private. So I think that the impact of not feeling fully like you're participating when those kind of things happen.
Yes, that sounds significant. Tameka, would you be willing to go next with particular impacts that you can think of?
Yeah,
Problems?
yeah, I would think that, if you have so many issues, with voting, for some people, they just might not, vote because it's like, this is a terrible experience. And people sometimes are not, feel like their vote doesn't matter anyway. So, when you go into the voting booth and you have, or try to use the machines, you're having all these types of problems. I can see people say, well, I'm just not going to vote because, it appears that it doesn't matter because they don't have when I need to vote. And then, I'm kind of not, feeling this whole voting thing, anyway. So, I just don't think we should give anyone a reason, not to vote or give them an excuse not to vote. So I would say that would be, in my opinion, one of the biggest impact is people just not ready, don't want to vote.
I can understand that it just doesn't feel worth the effort. Dessa, would you talk about the impact of access problems?
Absolutely. I totally agree with Cathy and Tameka in terms of like the personal impact and then the decision that so many people end up making to just not bother. And so there is a lower turnout amongst disabled voters than our non-disabled peers. And I know that a major reason for that is these exact kind of experiences that we're talking about, in addition to some other common experiences that people face in terms of maybe being disrespected by poll workers. Sometimes poll workers don't know the rules for disabled voters and the rights that we have. So for example, to Cathy's story, if a person needs help voting, they're allowed to do that. They're allowed to have somebody go with them of their choosing, as long as it's not their union rep or their employer. So if a person with an intellectual disability tries to do that and the poll worker says, oh, hey, you're not allowed to have anybody help you, that person's probably going to leave not voting. And that poll worker was incorrect when they asserted that rule. And so there's just all sorts of ways it shows up and then does suppress disabled voters as a group. And so I wanted to share a couple of numbers with you all to illustrate this. So between 2016 and 2020, 5.9%, there was a 5.9% increase in the percentage of disabled people that voted. Now, voter participation increased in 2020 for a lot of folks, and we know that was because there was all of this COVID mitigation happening that made it easier for people to vote from home, made it easier for people to vote over time, longer hours, more drop boxes. That was not just, that was in Detroit, but that was also across the country as a public health precaution. And whenever voting becomes more flexible, disabled people benefit enormously. So you might be trying to prevent COVID by having more options in voting, but what that's also doing is allowing more disabled people to participate. And so non-disabled people voted at a 5.3% increase between 16 and 20, and disabled people voted at a 5.9% increase in that 4-year gap, showing that when things are made accessible to us, when things are flexible to us, it really drives our turnout, but it actually boosts everyone's turnout. So it's like a no-brainer to me. So I think those numbers are interesting. And I think to something that Tameka said earlier, one of the other impacts is, I think Tameka and Cathy are with me on this, but I'll speak for myself. I think we need a disability voting block. I think we need a whole bunch of committed disabled people and our allies who are consciously and intentionally showing up to vote for candidates who actually care about our issues. And we can do that, we can even do that in nonpartisan ways. It's really, it's about having folks who represent our interests. And so one of the things that happens when the disability vote is suppressed is that we don't get as good a candidates, which then makes it harder for us to do anything else we're trying to do in our community. So obviously this is super important.
Thank you, Dessa. Tameka, aren't there rules to protect the rights of people dealing with disabilities?
Yes, there are, many rules, like Dessa shared about, people going into the voting booth. I know there's rules surrounding like absentee, voting. I know there's another rule that that many people don't know, but there is a thing called curbside voting. And so if the facility isn't accessible, which it should be, but, for what case, with people, with disabilities, they can drive up to their polling location, and the poll worker can bring, their ballot out for them to fill it out. So yeah, there's tremendous, different rules. I know Kathy's the expert, but the actual rule, helping voter. I know you might have to help me, Kathy. What's that? The
Help America Vote Act.
Yes. Kathy can speak more to that, but there are many rules that civil rights for people with disabilities when it comes to voting.
Thank you, Tameka. Cathy, would you talk to the rules, please?
There are other guidelines, but the more recent is the Help America Vote Act that was passed in 2002. And I was actually reviewing some of the information. I was so focused on disability rights coming out of that particular process that I forgot that it was really, you guys remember the punch card voting and the Chads? Well, that's how all that got started. And so it really affected provisional voting for everyone. And it affected a lot of civil rights issues for all voters. But because it also brought forward the voting machines that made it possible for many of us to vote independently, that's what stuck out in my mind. Those rules were put in place to make sure that every individual had full access and a right to vote. And it's, accessibility is a process. And so you can have it right one year and move your voting poll the next year and have to go through another process to be sure you still have it right. Or you'll forget something that you might have thought of the year before, maybe having a magnifying glass available on the table for people who need it, or having signs for those who are deaf or hard of hearing so that they have information about the direction of where to vote in that particular building without having to ask. So sometimes it's the small but important things that make voting accessible.
Thank you, Cathy. Dessa, what do you have to say about the rules that exist?
I'm glad for them. I'm extremely glad for them, but they are required to be enforced. People are required to be bought into them. People who are election officials really have to be committed, because to Cathy's point, accessibility is a process, and it kind of is dynamic in a lot of ways. So you could even have the same polling location 2 years in a row,
Yeah.
but somebody sets up the machines in a way that doesn't let a wheelchair go through one of those years, and then all of a sudden you have a problem. And so because of the way elections work, and we use all these other buildings that are normally used for other things, and because in Detroit in particular, we're losing community spaces, and sometimes these polling locations are opting out of being polling locations moving forward, and because the infrastructure here is old, so a lot of polling locations are kind of shoddy in the access department anyway. It is a lot to manage, and I think the laws are there. Unfortunately, a lot of times to enforce a law, you have to have a lawsuit, or you have to file a formal complaint, and that's just not something that's accessible or possible for a lot of people. And so I think it's our job as organizers and activists to really, if we work in elections, like really beef up our commitment to disability inclusion in that process, and then as outsiders, really be paying attention to disability inclusion whenever we're fighting for disability, or for fighting for voting rights specifically, right? So I guess I'm thinking too many things at once, but one thing on my mind is laws are one thing, but these problems are systemic. So it's not just laws that can fix it. All the laws in the world don't work if the people implementing them don't care. And so and I'm not saying people don't care, but I do think that there is a neglect and an invisibilization of disabled people as voters in this context that results in something like not caring. And so when a place isn't set up accessibly, when a machine is not learned how to be used, that is showing priority towards non-disabled people intentionally or not. And so creating a culture where everyone has responsibility, all the poll workers have responsibility for making sure it's an accessible experience, making sure that everyone's up to date on what the laws and regulations are, is really an important part of the accessibility. People have to be bought into it and encouraged to have a commitment to it, because it's going to be a dynamic situation. And you're going to poll workers are going to have to improvise sometimes and get outside of their comfort zone sometimes. And if they're expecting to do that, I think there's going to be better outcomes for the voters that they're helping. I think another important thing to talk about in this context in terms of the rules that protect disabled voters, as my friends here have said, there are plenty of laws protecting disabled voters. And it's important to remember that disabled voters also have other identities that make voting trickier for them. So, we also are impacted by voter suppression based on race or class or gender identity or incarceration status, et cetera, because disabled people are all of those things. So we got to approach it from that intersectional perspective too.
Thank you, Dessa. Let me see. Dessa, what can the audience do to help?
Oh, sure, thanks. I guess I started going down that train a minute ago. Yeah, I again, like all of us, whether we're internal to election processes or outside activists, have a role to increasing disability consciousness in the voting process, and everywhere, I think. So learning about the history of the fight for disability voting rights, I think, is important. I know we're going to share some resources later that people can read, but reminding yourself and learning about the struggle for voting rights for disabled people and for other groups that had to fight really hard for that right, I think is an important motivator, because then we maybe don't take stuff for granted as much. And I think, whether you're disabled or not, whether you're having an access fail moment or not, if you're paying attention, if you're engaged in anything related to voting rights, voting access, pay attention to processes that may not be working for various disabled people. So if you go to vote and you notice that there's no ramp, tell the person in charge of that poll that there's no ramp. Just because you didn't need it doesn't mean you shouldn't say something about it. And I can't get in there to tell them myself, or I would, right? So we need allies making some noise and hyping up how important it is to ensure that their disabled peers are voting. And particularly when you're talking about, how do we expand voting rights in Michigan through legislation or ballot initiatives or whatever, making sure that there's a disability perspective and input from disability community is going to be really key if you want that policy to actually meet the needs of people in the voting booth.
Thank you, Dessa. Cathy, do you have some suggestions for things that the audience can do to help?
Sure. One of my dreams is to have more people use the voting machine. It's wonderful for seniors because you can do large print. It's still private. It's a fairly easy machine to use. And if more people used it just because they liked it and it's kind of the electronic thing, then we'd probably have less issues with it because it would become a popular piece of equipment. So that's one of my wishes. I also think on our side as people with disabilities, when there is an opportunity to join the League of Women Voters or to be a part of a process from another perspective, but bring our own concerns and issues into play, that's very important. And I've really been enjoying my work with the League for that reason, because you do get to do education from another perspective, and to look at disability as part of that process. And I think just continuing to share information with each other is crucial. I think Dessa's comment about observing what's going on at a polling site and reporting an issue if you see it is also very important. One of the members of the commission I ran in Dearborn got so good at it that he probably did as much for wheelchair access at the polls as any of us, and he was able to walk into the polling site, but he just never let it go. If the ramp wasn't accessible, he was right up there speaking about it, and he worked across disabilities in that realm too. So I think the other thing we can do as people with disabilities is not just be mindful of our own needs, but our whole congregate of people.
Thank you, Cathy. Tameka, what are your suggestions?
Yeah, so the one thing that comes to mind is just being an ally. So ally can be very things. It can be, like what Dessa said, being observant of, issues that might, hinder people with disabilities to vote. That could mean, joining, a disability organization like, Detroit Disability Power, or, I volunteer work with Warriors on Wheels, because we're on the ground, working on voting issues when it pertains to, people with disabilities. So, checking out what, organizations, that serve people with disabilities and what you can do to help them. And, just, being aware of the issues. It's good to understand, the rights and the history, of that as well. So when you at the on location and you hear things or you see things that's not correct, because you understand, the rights and the history of it. So there's multiple ways to be an ally, but be an ally. So
Thank you. Thank you all. We will go to questions soon. I'd like to introduce Ruth Coolwine, who is one of the members of our committee, and I can't bring her video up. It's not letting me. So Ruth is a member of our committee, and she very kindly records the questions throughout the program. Cheryl Bukoff is also a member of our committee, and they've both worked for several months now with Dessa and Cathy and Tameka to try to pull this together. Do you have any closing thoughts before we go to questions? No?
No.
Ruth?
Thank you so much for the discussion so far. It's really insightful, really enlightening. Our first question is sort of a double-headed one. I'll do one and then the next. The first part of it is, what is the greatest or most common impediment when you try, or not you personally, but across a sort of field of the able who need help or need access? Sorry, I'm making this a little bit messy. Let me try that again. What is the greatest and most common impediment needed for accessibility, or to be resolved for accessibility? Is there one? Maybe is the other question inside that one.
This is Cathy. I think we've given a range of examples, and it probably often depends on the person who's trying to actively vote as to what it might be at that point. I'm not sure how to answer the question.
I know with the work that I've done at Warriors of Wales and alongside Dessa, I think with when we were working with the city of Detroit, the common issues like the voting machines, but then also it was inaccessible voting locations, and education of the poll workers. I think those were like the most common issues, that we that I saw. And Dessa, you could definitely chime in if you agree as well. But those were like the most common issues that I've seen when it comes to addressing accessibility for people with disabilities.
Yeah, this is Dessa. I agree. I think, there's the nitty gritty. How's the problem show up for an individual voter at any individual moment? But I think, like zooming back out a little bit, the major problem is that disabled voters are not prioritized. And that's the, well, there's probably a root behind that, right? Which is called ableism, the systemic discrimination of disabled people. And where does that come from? I mean, that's a whole nother conversation, but I do think like there's kind of, as we've said before, you can have a really great plan for accessibility even, but if folks don't really understand the nuance of like what that means in practice or how to navigate and adapt in the moment, it's only going to go so far. So it's really good to have the excellent accessibility plans so that no matter what type of access need someone has, that there's a really high chance of it getting met. But it really is this bigger situation of like taking the time to understand the nuance, taking the time to understand what that means for process, changing process, having a cultural commitment to the inclusion piece. That's all needed to rectify the problems that end up happening that we've heard about tonight. So it's kind of unsatisfying because you can't like check a box and be like, we're good. But that's just the reality of it. And I actually think there's something really beautiful about that reality, which is that we have to have relationships and we have to be human with each other. It can't just be something distant like a checkbox.
This is related and I think has in many ways sort of talked about already, but if you could change one thing first, fast, with your magic wand, what would it be?
This is Dessa. Since it's a magic wand, I think I can go a little farther out there. I think I would want to have secure, private, accessible electronic voting, and that it would be available to people over a period of time, not just one day.
I like that.
Sweet, let's do it, Cathy.
With your magic wand.
Yeah.
Tameka, did you want to third that suggestion, or do you have another idea?
Oh, I think that's good too.
Yeah, that's a good thing to know. The next question is, it sounds like what your negative voting experiences have in common and what they have in common with mine as a disabled voter are issues with poll worker education. How do you think we address that deficit?
This is Cathy. We in the beginning, it was actually expected that we would do some education and training because of the newness of the voting machines and issues around access. So we're talking in the early 2000s. But as time has gone on, it's almost like, well, everybody knows that now. And the problem with accessibility is it's an ongoing, as I said, it can be messy and it's a process. And the minute you change one staff member or, things just get hectic because there are so many other things that the clerks have to keep in mind and the poll workers have to keep in mind, that this sort of gets down the chain of training. And so I think it just has to be included in a meaningful way in training for poll workers. So if that means having people with disabilities as part of that training, as Detroit Disability Power tried to do, so they can talk more about that because I'm not sure how that's going, that's really part of the process, so that it's right up there right from the beginning.
Yeah, I
Okay.
would say the same. The thing that's what I work with Dessa on too with Detroit Disability Power with the city of Detroit. So we actually brought in disabled people to educate the poll workers, and we even talked about T-shirts on the day of, saying volunteer or showing that person, the poll worker is the point person, to address those issues. It's supposed to be spread out the so I don't know that's if you thought it worked or not, but no, we at least tried. So
We did try. We actually designed a training for the city of Detroit to offer to poll workers with all sorts of information about the laws, about disability etiquette. And, I think we made some progress, but I think that we have a long way to go, honestly. And it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about this being a systemic issue. It's not the easiest thing to fix, but it's absolutely possible. So we need the political will to prioritize it.
Thank you. And we have a question about what are the access issues with mail-in ballots? Are there any, or are those sort of a preferred method?
Actually, this is Cathy. I was just reading in the last article you'll see on the resource list, some of the issues for the voting, the proposals for some of the new voting laws, and one of them is about mail-in ballots. For some people, the drop boxes are easier, and there's no cost. And the more drop boxes, the better. Instead of decreasing them, we should be thinking about what we can do to make that happen. And for many people, mail-in ballots is really important because being able to vote absentee and from home gives fuller access. For people who are blind or visually impaired or may have a learning disability or really need that voting machine to fully independently vote, the mail-in ballot might not be the most accessible. And for me, it felt like a setback to have to do an absentee ballot again when I couldn't get out during COVID. So as with all things, it kind of depends on the person with the disability, but certainly having access to mail-in ballots and having more time, not just one day to vote, could be very important.
I know with some of the issues when it came to mail-in ballots I've seen is that people don't know who can turn in their ballots, like who's authorized to turn them in. So that was an issue that myself and another person, ACLU, was trying to figure out, that particular answer. I'm trying to remember what the answer was. So it's like in theory, would it be an issue like somebody, like your neighbor, turning in? I don't think so, but but I know people like when you turn it into the polling, the clerk's office is such, that might become an issue. So, but I know that was one of the main concerns that people had was who could turn in their mail-in ballots.
And this is Dessa. I think the only thing I would add is just that choices are critical. Like having multiple options is really the way to make anything the most accessible, because then people can choose what works. And, I think there are states that only do mail in, they don't even have polling locations. And I think there's some benefits to that. But I also think, disabled, like sometimes what will happen in these kind of conversations is that people say like, well, all you disabled people, you should just vote by mail and then we don't have to make the polling sites accessible. And as Cathy has said, the mail option isn't accessible to everyone, but also we need to be seen voting. Like we need to be there repping our community in the process of engaging in the democratic process. And so options, like legit options, are the best thing.
Thank you. Another question about voter education and just learning about what's on the ballot, and if there's voter access issues in that regard that might impede accessibility to voting also.
Can you repeat the question, Ruth?
Are there any accessibility issues in regards to getting educated about what's on the ballot? Do you find that to be relatively easy, or is that something that is another aspect of accessibility?
This is Cathy. I think with the Vote 411 that the League has begun, and that is an accessible site. It for people who are blind or low vision. It really varies because website access varies as to what might be available or accessible. But that particular site does seem to work. So it would give you information about your own local voting issues.
And I think also what could be an issue is people understanding what is their rights or what are the rules surrounding absentee voting and and everything. I know that's one thing I did do during 2020, 2019 was a series of voting education, and it could be complicated, and and things like signing an affidavit, and all those different things that people may not know. As far as with the one issue when it came to that people had confusion around was like mailing in their ballot because that was their first time doing like the absentee, and like having a stamp, like there's some envelopes, absentee ballots can have stamps on the envelopes for them to mail it back in. So it's like, what do I do in this case? Or how do I, it's gonna be hard for me to get a stamp. So, I think voting education is, of course, very important, but particularly for people with disabilities, so they do know what their rights are in the laws pertaining to each election.
This is Dessa. And then in addition to making sure that like training materials and websites and any sort of public facing stuff is done in an accessible format, which is, in terms of like screen readability and plain language, different modes of communication to make sure that it's accessible to people that communicate in different ways. But there's there's also, oh my goodness, am I forgetting what I was going to say? That might be happening. Oh my gosh, Ruth, what's the question again? I got so caught up in
That's
listening
fine.
to Cathy. And Tameka.
Yeah, just wondering how accessible information is in regards to voting and learning what's about on the ballot, learning how to vote even. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think it's really important that candidates and campaigns are specifically talking to disabled voters. So when a candidate or a campaign is putting out a platform or doing a press conference, mention us, speak to our issues, speak to us directly. We notice that kind of thing because people don't do it that much. And so, if you're running an issue campaign or a ballot campaign, make sure that you're doing presentations that are done accessibly. Make sure you're doing presentations to disability orgs and communities. And really remember that we're a constituency that you should be courting. There's a lot of us. And if campaigns were courting us as voters, as they really strategically should be, that would really increase our access to information in the process.
And that would include having people who sign more often available at different events. And thank you for having somebody at yours.
Yes, thank you, Sean. We appreciate having you here today.
Yeah, and Jennifer, that's the end of the written comments. If we want to open it up for.
I had April earlier before I realized that I'd given people the ability to unmute. And so I will let people talk, and April in particular would like to. And I ask that you do use the raise your hand option. Go on to reactions at the bottom of the screen and you can raise your hand. And that way we won't have several people talking at once. April? Are you still with us?
Second. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, I was muted. I was like, hello. I don't know why I do that.
Everyone
Anyways,
does
yep,
it.
I'm still here, and I actually, that's funny because I was just about to type you I was gonna make a comment. Actually, I was gonna type. And did you guys have a question or anything for
No,
me?
it's just that I wanted you to weigh in again because you were
Yep.
speaking earlier about how valuable you thought this session would be.
Absolutely.
Did
Oh my
find it
God, it
valuable.
is so valuable, and each one of you, it's I was just thinking like it's we've come a long way, but like someone said, sorry, that's my iPhone. Basically, it's hard because it shouldn't be like this. It shouldn't. I feel like we should be farther than this situation with voting. So but no, I'm really amazed because, like I said, I'm a part of the Connecticut Council on Developmental Disabilities, and this totally is basically one of our initiatives. So and then of course there's councils in just about every state. So every state, like, they're similar, but I don't know like everything about what other states are doing. But I would definitely recommend people join the council and things of that nature. A council, or I'm sure you already are. I hear that you I was pretty impressed that you guys knew. I'm sorry, I forgot who said that they heard of the council, but that was pretty cool. And I'm also, like I said, I'm also a blind person, so that's very helpful for me as well. So yeah, I'm just disturbed by, like, I just, one thing I've always hated, and I think most of us do, or disliked, is when people talk to us like we're 5-year-olds. It's like, no, So yeah,
we're all nodding in agreement, April.
I feel like, and I feel like it's like we have a right to our privacy supposedly, but we don't. I mean, what sense does that make? I mean, unless, like you said, unless we so choose to have someone, but that, that's not the point.
Yeah.
It's like,
This is Cathy. Before we I don't know how much time we have left, but we put together a list of resources that we will be emailing out to people.
great.
And the last one we added today talks about the new voting laws that are being discussed.
Mhm.
And there's actually implications for people with disabilities within that framework.
Right.
And I would really encourage people to read that particular article.
Absolutely, I would definitely do that. And I just wanted to say one other thing. I don't know if I can send my email along, because any events that you guys do online, and I'm very thankful. This is very accessible, even though it has its issues. It's like that love-hate relationship, but that in and of itself, right there, even if you're in the same state, the webinars do make things more accessible, because not everybody has transportation so easily. So I mean, I'm so thankful for these, and so any event I'd like to, just be a part of if I can.
This is Jennifer again. I was told it was a very simple way that I could capture everyone who is in the program and their emails and send them the document that we have. I can't
Okay.
find it.
Sure.
So if people will send an email to me, I'm putting my email address at, I will make sure that you get the document. And part of what I've been doing during the meeting, well, even though I'm interested in the topic, is trying to figure out what did he say to do? And it doesn't look like I can see what he said I could find.
No, it's okay. It happens, right? That's what I was saying. It has its issues. Like I always get anxious, like right before I start getting into a meeting, I'm like, oh, come on, please get in, I don't know.
I am happy to send things to people.
What's your name again?
My name is Jennifer Dye.
Jennifer. Okay, I didn't recognize your voice for a second. Jennifer Dye. Okay.
Yes, I try to, Dessa has trained me, and I'm trying to remember to identify myself whenever I speak. So my
no, don't worry.
DYE at DetroitPublicLibrary.org. I will make sure that the document gets out to people, but not everyone who registered on Eventbrite showed up. And
yeah,
some of the people who show up don't get onto Eventbrite. So I hate to just send it out to everyone on Eventbrite.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, because not everybody, like some people don't even know what it is. So
we talked about posting it on the two websites for the Detroit League and
we certainly
for the
can.
library. So that'll help.
I'm so glad to talk to you guys. Thank you so much for weighing in with me. And this is really great. And, asking me, that was just funny because I was just about to type to you guys. So I had thoughts and I didn't want to interrupt while you guys were talking. So, but thank you so much. Great
Thank
people.
you, April.
You guys are great people. Thank you for your work. You're welcome.
Does anyone else have something they want to contribute?
There is another question that came up in the chat. This is Ruth speaking. I can read that out. It's addressed to Dessa and Tameka. Could you share the steps you took to start poll worker education in your city for non-Detroiters, please?
This is Dessa. You're asking me to remember something pre-pandemic, which is a little hard for my brain at the moment. So Tameka, we should tag team this. Do you know what we did first?
Yeah, well, so I know this was before I came shortly after, but it was the election. And I think that's when you saw all the issues alongside other disabled advocates, and we formed the coalition, the Voters with Disabilities Coalition with other organizations. And so, so we came together, and then we went to the city clerk and just say, hey, schedule a meeting with her and say, this is, we have some issues. We did a survey. So people, who had people with disabilities who had issues, they filled out the survey. And so, we went to her and to the team and said, these are, the issues, and, how can we, how can you get this, fixed? And so they invited us to the table to work with them. It's like 6+ years out of the next election to get it done.
And this is Dessa, we met monthly with some of the clerk staff. This coalition did, and every time we would go in there, we would both educate them about disability voting rights and disability respecting disabled voters, and also make very direct recommendations of how to increase the accessibility in the voting process. And so then, that's where the idea for training poll workers came from, those conversations. That's where having like an access point person at each precinct came up. That's where an idea for a hotline to call on election day if there was any access issues came up. It was through that continued relationship over time with the clerk's office. And right up until the pandemic, we were meeting regularly with them. And actually, if you remember, Michigan shut down the day after the March primary of 2020. And so that day, the day before everything shut down, we were all out there looking at all these different polling locations, making sure stuff was working well. And there was kind of a lot of problems. And so it really made us, I know it made me think about like, okay, we've been spending all this time doing this. Why isn't it working? What we need to go back to the drawing board. But then of course the pandemic hit like right away. And so some of that has looked different than it probably would have otherwise. But it is, I do think one of the key parts is the relationship over time.
Thank you. This is, go ahead, Tameka.
I agree.
Okay, just agreeing. This is Jennifer again. We have a question that I'm going to, Kristen has her hand raised, but I wanted to say that if Dessa and Tameka, you have any sort of a document that could be pulled together that we could send out to people, just a summation of the things that need to be done, that would be useful.
There is, if you even just Google ADA checklist,
Thank you.
there's a very valuable from the Department of Justice, an ADA checklist and then I know Dessa's also put some documents together, but that is immediately available.
Yes, I'm not talking about, I know that this is not something you just toss off, but I appreciate your experience. Kristen, you have a question?
Yes, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you? Oh, thank you. Okay. This is a follow-up. That was my question. So thank you for answering it. I live in Grosse Pointe Park, and I see, Cathy, that your name says that you are from Grosse Pointe. I have had a suboptimal experience as a disabled voter in Grosse Pointe Park. I will put that politely. And so I would definitely, I have tried in my own vociferous way to make change here. But that's why I was asking, are you all willing to share your contact information if I wanted
Yes.
to maybe follow up? Or, okay, thank you very much. Thank you for indulging my questions. And thank you all for doing this.
Yes, I saw the ADA checklist for polling places in our chat.
Can we put our email, or at least my email in the chat?
Yes, certainly.
So it's mcmc adam@gmail.com.
I think Charles had a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Ruth, did you see that?
I can read that. This is Ruth. I can read Charles's question, unless Charles, you prefer to ask yourself. Okay, so are any of your organizations part of the clerk engagement teams?
This is Dessa. We have been involved with that, but not recently. There's a group of folks doing that work that have a standing meeting at exactly the same time I have this other standing meeting. So I'm on the emails, I read them, I'm not in the meetings, but I do think it's a really smart way to organize.
Yeah, same thing with Warrants on Wheels. We have a relationship with the clerk's office too, but we're very busy, but yeah.
All right. Any more questions right now? Well, thank you. Thank you, Dessa, Cathy, Tameka, and Sean.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
This has
thank you,
been-
everyone, for coming. I hope it has been helpful. We will try to keep you informed as soon as I get email addresses and send them out. I'm learning.
We're all learning. You're doing great.
Okay.
I do want to say, just as another person, another part who worked on this, that Tameka, Dessa, and Cathy are absolutely great. They met with us 3 times. A lot of it was educating ourselves.
And
Certainly.
educating us.
At least me, I still could use a lot more. So I should probably tag along and just observe, do some observations myself on some of this and learn more from them. But at any rate, it's I really appreciate it, and I know we, our planning committee, does. So you were all wonderful, and those that came, I think your questions were terrific too. And our interpreter, San, thank you very much.
Yes, we're always looking for more suggestions on topics that relate to Michigan and Detroit. They are not limited to Michigan and Detroit.
Great.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much. And I will send my
Thank you.
email along to you, Jennifer, separately.
Thank you.
Thank you. You guys are great. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Good night.
Bye.